Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to Your Story Stinks, the podcast where I talk about terrible story ideas. It's been a while since I've talked about J.K. Rowling. I think the last time I talked about her, I was talking about her last crime novel, and it was terrible. And I'll be honest, the reason it was terrible was unique, and that's why I wanted to talk about it then. That was during the height of her being an outspoken transphobe, and her novel was basically the equivalent of a Chappelle special, where she was just venting her feelings, and everything in that novel was about the same stuff. Like, she writes about an author who was murdered for being anti trans, and then spends the entire thing writing from the perspective of other characters who are basically like, oh man, I don't want to get canceled. Like, that whole book is terrible. And so I bring all that up because when I talk about Harry Potter, a lot of people sort of put her modern lack of tact, I guess, or her modern views that are not good, and they apply them to the previous works as though the previous works were all bad because of things that happened in the future. One of the things that I think is really hard to do as a person who wants to believe that we as a species get better over time is look at the past and understand that things were different. And I bring that up not as an excuse. I'm not saying, oh, it's a product of its time, that makes it okay. I'm bringing this up because people want to, rightly, I think, use her bigotry as a way of avoiding deeper critiques. Because her bigotry really isn't noticeable, I guess, in her early writings, especially Harry Potter, and so it's not a real applicable reason to critique them, in my view. One of the things that I think is true with fiction is that authors can be as terrible as possible, and it only matters in two ways. The first being what they did at the time that they were alive and expressing these views, and two, how much it actually comes through in their writing. So, to give an example, Lovecraft was a virulent racist. That doesn't stop the fact from people enjoying the Cthulhu mythos. Okay, Hemingway was a spy for the KGB. That doesn't stop people from enjoying his writings. As my grandmother used to say, being an old Jewish woman that she was, if you removed every book in the library written by an anti-Semite, you would have no books. I bring all of this up because when we talk about J.K. Rowling, I don't want you to think that, oh, I'm just ignoring the whole anti-trans thing. That's a part of her identity at this point, and it's there, but it doesn't explain the problems with the work. The anti-trans thing and her being up her own ass and her being way too online is a problem with her mystery novels because that's what she's dealing with in the moment. And J.K. Rowling is a writer who is fundamentally incapable of writing about things outside of her own lived experience. Now, this, on its face, is not a flaw. Authors really should start by writing what they know because it's probably the thing that they're the best at writing. Speaking from personal experience, I knew a lot of people back in college who wanted to write anime-style stories, and my question to them was always, do you know anything about Japanese culture that isn't rooted in consumer products? And the answer was always no. Like, you should write what you know, usually as a starting point. But the problem with J.K. Rowling comes when she is forced to sort of expand the world, and we get to my, well, favorite problem that so many stories have, which is the bigger your scope, the bigger your problems. And most stories will live or die based on whether or not the author can handle that bigger scope and those bigger problems. J.K. Rowling, unfortunately, is not one of those authors. So again, for the purposes of this episode, I want to remove as many exterior critiques as I can. I don't want surface level critiques. One of the things that I try to do with this podcast, one of the things that I try to harp on is when you're making a critique about a work, you want to remove as many value judgments as you can. When I talked about Lore Olympus, for example, I tried to remove my own personal feelings about whether or not something was, say, feminist or anti-feminist. Because my view is that concepts like that can be, well, they can be whatever you want them to be when you boil them right down. The same things that can be seen as sort of empowering can later be interpreted as regressive. That's just kind of the nature of perceptions. And so when I look at a work, I try to analyze it based on practical problems. Stories are formulaic in many ways because the formula works. Storytelling is an art, and there's ways to do it right and ways to do it wrong. And so when you do something wrong, when you're telling a story, you can go deeper than, oh, this character is bad, this character is offensive, this character does things I don't agree with. There are usually worse problems underneath those kinds of critiques. There are usually structural issues with the stories that you sort of have to deal with. And so it's on that level that I want to talk about Harry Potter, because Harry Potter is, in some ways, kind of amazing. What I mean is that it does so many things right at first, and then fundamentally drops the ball 5 books in my view. Now, some people will disagree with this, and that mostly, in my opinion, comes down to whether or not you enjoy the kind of story that's being told in the first 4 books or the kind of story that's being told in the last 3. Because they're 2 separate kinds of stories. And I will get into that. But removing my own personal opinion, removing what I can assume is other people's personal opinions, it's sort of amazing that the thing that made the stories work is the thing that she gets away from the longer she wrote the series. And let's just get this out of the way. No matter how much we personally disagree with her opinions as a person, her story basically revolutionized an entire industry. She's the one who inserted this sort of young adult novel back into prominence. Without Harry Potter, there probably isn't like a Hunger Games or a Twilight or any of the things that came after. Simply put, Harry Potter changed the game, and in 100 years, we're probably going to look back at her as being the young adult version of Lovecraft. Terrible person, revolutionary stories. And like Lovecraft, it's kind of amazing that her story had such ripple effects because they're such simple stories, and I can only assume or only conclude that the reason for this is because the late 80s and early 90s were not good to the young adult novel. I think in this case it's a situation where she was in the right time at the right place and wrote something that people hadn't seen before, or at the very least hadn't seen in a long enough time that it felt new and different. You could probably write an entire thesis about the revolutions in media that was designed for consumption around this time. Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings did this for movies, where before Peter Jackson's epic trilogy, it was just sort of expected that movies were gonna suck, that blockbusters were gonna suck. And he essentially made a masterpiece and single-handedly revised what people expected from movies. He changed the game. And that's sort of how I see Rowling when we talk about what did Harry Potter do for the genre? What did it do at the time that was so different? Now, I'm old enough that I can talk about this from a first person perspective because I was a kid when the books came out, and as I got older, I saw the movies come out, to the point where the last movies were coming out when I was graduating high school. So, to contrast that with my sister, when she was in high school, the Hunger Games were always really big. She didn't have the same experience that I did. So when I was really young, when I was still like 7 or 8, when you talked fantasy books, you were talking old school fantasy books. You were talking The Lord of the Rings, The Last Unicorn, you were talking C.S. Lewis with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. You were talking books that were over 20 years old, usually even more than that, when you talked about fantasy designed for young adults. Rowling herself at the time is writing about something that she knows, and again, this works. She writes about a British kid growing up in the 90s. Rowling is a British person who was growing up in the 90s. When she sets the story in the 90s for a reason, because she's writing at the same time as she's living, which makes it really easy to sort of grasp onto the narrative. This isn't a story that needs to take place in the future or the distant past. It's easy, really, to kind of step into the story, at least when it came out, because it felt like the time that it was being written in, because it was. Contrast this with, say, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. C.S. Lewis was writing stories, again, at the time, that were set at the time he was alive. But the problem is that it's been 60 years at this point, and so things that were chronologically of the time feel outdated now, in the same way that much of Harry Potter feels outdated now because it's written and set in the 90s, which is, again, 20 plus years ago. If Harry Potter had come out in the 90s and been set in, say, 1977, it probably wouldn't have caught on as interesting as that might have been. Like, as an adult thinking about trying to set the whole story in the 70s, I don't know, that sounds like a really good story, but it would absolutely not have worked for Harry Potter. The story works because it resonates with people at the time. It feels like the 90s. I'm going to keep harping on this because when I get to why the story breaks down, in my opinion, it's gonna come up. But Rowling was at her best when she's writing about things that she knows very well. She's writing about a kid who is ostracized from basically everyone. She is writing a story about discovery and about coming into your own, and it's all set at a time in which she understands very well because she is young enough that she has her finger on the pulse of the culture. So everything sort of clicks, and it doesn't require a ton of effort. To contrast it with Fantastic Beasts, which is set in 1920s America, a time period and a country which J.K. Rowling knows nothing about, and so nothing works because it makes many assumptions which don't gel with the time period that she's trying to write. Or, to skip ahead a little bit when I talk about the later books, when she tries to write about any other part of the world, because she simply doesn't understand other countries. She doesn't understand their culture, she doesn't understand their way of doing things, and she's fundamentally incurious. When I talked about her mystery novels, I brought this up repeatedly, which is she's fundamentally an incurious person. And that's not necessarily always a death sentence for a writer, but it is a death sentence for a writer when you're trying to write about the real world and real people. If she had set this in a completely different fantasy world, which is what most incurious writers do, it probably wouldn't have been as big of an issue. But she intentionally sets it at a time period and a place which is real, so that she can relate to things that she knows and which the audience knows in order to further draw them into the story. And so when she can no longer do that, the connection between work and audience is broken and it all sort of falls apart. I mentioned earlier about people I knew in college trying to write about Japan, having no concept of what Japan is actually like, or what the people actually go through, or what they personally think and how they deal with it. And so they obviously couldn't write those things well. J.K. Rowling is the same. She struggles, beginning with, I think, the fourth book, to really expand her universe because she intentionally builds it on such narrow scaffolding. And I will explain what I mean by that. The point which I want to get across, the point that needs to be hammered home again and again, is the same thing that allows her to succeed initially is the same reason it all falls apart. Because the benefit that it gives her in the beginning becomes a drawback as the story continues. Once you realize this, it becomes omnipresent. You see it everywhere, in every part of the story, in every character. And this is where I talk about one of the strongest aspects of the story in the initial books, which is the magic system, or, in better phrased terms, the lack of a magic system. Rowling, as a writer, because, as I said, she's incurious, assumes that her audience is also going to be incurious, and so it doesn't suit her to flesh out the magic system because it doesn't really matter. The story isn't about the magic system. The story is about wizards who just can do things because they're wizards. So she can play fast and loose with the rules, because you never really need to write them down. It's just sort of assumed that things are the way they are when they're introduced. For example, we don't need to know how wands are made. We don't have to know why certain ones work better than others. All we need to know is that, oh, they're all unique, and they're all basically made of wood, and then they have something in them which makes them magical. That's all we need. And really, that works. It functions in the story as a way to draw the audience in. The audience can be like, oh, that's cool, and then move on without it being something that bogs everything down. When we see things like giant monsters, or we see stairs that move on their own, or paintings that move on their own and are sentient, we, as an audience, don't really need to know how they work, because it all boils down to a wizard did it, and that's enough. When you're introduced to things like potions and the concept of, okay, you need these ingredients, we don't really need to know why you need those specific ingredients. It's enough that these ingredients are magical and they do the things that the characters need them to do. One of the strengths of the early books is that the magical systems are pretty much unexplained across the board, and so anything can happen without breaking the underlying sort of reality paradigm that's going on. We, as an audience, never really feel the need to call bullshit on the author because there's no rules to be broken. Contrast this for a moment with many, I never know how to pronounce this, isekai. They're the reincarnation stories, where all of them are sort of focused intently on the underlying system, to their detriment. It's why so many of them are so bad. The reincarnation stories really like to stress the powers, whether it's like the cultivation stories in manhwa, or the various different literary RPGs, they love their systems. And as a result, they often hit the wall, which is, we've written rules about how things work, and now we need to break them because the narrative won't work unless we break the rules we spent all this time establishing. The whole story breaks down at that point. Harry Potter works because the author has never established hard and fast rules for how magic shit works, and so she can just do things. Furthermore, as the envelope is pushed, she can do more and more things and just sort of hand wave it because magic can basically do anything. You can travel through time, you can see the future, you can turn a bus into an apartment building. You can do anything you want because magic is just sort of a hand-waving excuse to explain why things are happening. Usually, cool things, or at least things that the author wants you to think are cool. In essence, the entire magic system initially works on rule of cool logic, where if it's cool, we'll just roll with it and say it works. I will also point out that she does this with everything, including world building. In fact, that's another reason why it works initially. Rowling wants her wizards to all be like the stereotype wizard that we think of, with hats and robes and wands and broomsticks, and so she just says they do this. Why do they all act like it's still the Middle Ages? Because that's just what wizards do. They're all isolated from society, for the most part. Why do they ride broomsticks as opposed to anything else? Because she says they do. Why do they not take advantage of other advancements in science? Because she doesn't want them to. Like, everything in the story is presented essentially on rule of cool. Oh, there's a washing machine, and it's sentient. Why? Because it is. Isn't that cool? It's an example of things you shouldn't do. Why is there a flying car? Because it seemed like a cool idea. Why is there a giant tree which is on campus to bludgeon anyone who gets close? No idea. It seemed like a cool thing to add to the story. Rowling at no point needs to sit down and explain where all this comes from or why they do things this way. It's enough for her to say, this is how it is, and because she's writing the story from the perspective of somebody who is an outsider, she can basically do a stranger in a strange land. For those of you who don't know what that is or haven't read it, Stranger in a Strange Land is a book from 1962 about a futuristic situation where a person who was born and raised on Mars has to come back to Earth and experience the culture which he has no personal experience with. That's where it comes from. Harry, because he is entirely separated from this world, can be the audience's eyes. He can experience everything and mostly be a blank slate because everything he encounters is going to be new. He has no outside opinion on anything. And his two best friends are structured perfectly as being two sides of the spectrum. On one hand, you have Ron, who is born and raised in a magical family and doesn't know anything but magic. On the other hand, you have Hermione, who is born and raised among people who deal in the mundane world, and so she knows all about science and technology. And these two people come together and act almost like an angel and devil sort of thing, where they can sort of act as the audience's, I don't want to say conscience, but they act as a way to kind of help the audience understand the world around them so that Harry doesn't himself have to make choices about things. In fact, once you realize this, that Ron and Hermione aren't so much characters in their own right, but expressions of two different sort of lifestyles that the author is trying to play off each other, it makes a lot more sense why things happen the way they do. I think the best example of this, about the author trying to avoid having her main character take a stance on anything, is the house elf situation. So in one of the books, I forget which one, I think it's 3, it might be 4, Hermione discovers that the house elves are basically slaves, and she objects to this. She, someone born in the mundane world where slavery is a terrible thing, rightly so, objects to all of this. Meanwhile, Ron, somebody who was born and raised in the magical world, looks at her and goes, "What are you talking about? This is normal. This is how everything's always worked. This is where they're happy," etc., etc. Harry himself doesn't really need to make a decision one way or the other because the pros and cons of both arguments are made for him by these two characters who are around him. In fact, one of the things that works is that because Harry is basically our eyes into the world, and because he is constantly surrounded by people who are all doing things, he himself only needs to kind of succeed on the most basic sense. Like, yeah, he's the chosen one and all that, but at every point in the story, things are demonstrated by other characters doing things for him. Here's an example of this in later books. I think it's in the 5th one. Dolores Umbridge is cracking down on everyone. And so Fred and George demonstrate this, or demonstrate how out of touch and how bad she is by making a huge swamp and making a huge show of the fact that they're leaving. This allows Harry himself to sort of look at this and go, oh yeah, everybody loves them and doesn't like her, and it's explained immediately, visually, viscerally, why these two different perspectives are clashing. Rowling really loves to present contrary opposites. And in some ways this is really stupid, and in some ways it works. Voldemort works as an idea in the beginning because he's presented as Satan, essentially. He's the embodiment of everything is bad. You could essentially sing the Grinch song from The Grinch Stole Christmas, and it would apply to him because that's how evil he's supposed to be. He's not even really a figure. He's just kind of like a boogeyman who is so terrible that all of the stories have been shared as hush whispers because he was that bad. So I'm basically, at this point, getting to the section where I can't talk about anything good, because when you delve into anything, you immediately run up to the wall where everything falls apart. And in my opinion, this all sort of came to a head in the 4th book. Now, I said earlier that, in my opinion, the first 4 books and the last 3 are different stories. And yeah, they might all take place in the same universe. Yes, they might all be in the same series, but narratively, they are entirely different stories in terms of structure. The first 4 books, I think, are personally the better ones because they focus on this idea of exploration, of mystery, where new things are being thrown at us, where we are, as an audience, getting used to this world where the author is our only window into the world. This is also why, when I talked about Fantastic Beasts failing, I mentioned the fact that screenwriting is much different than writing novels, because a novel allows the author to completely control every aspect of the story. The author is the only one talking to the reader. She can decide how things are presented. She can decide how much we see of something or how little we see of something. Whereas with film and with screenwriting, you have things like editing or actors, where anything can change an audience's interpretation of things. You might call it the Loki effect, where Loki in the Avengers movie is presented as a ruthless fascist, and after a few years people are like, oh, but he's hot, and so now he's a misunderstood, troubled bad boy looking for redemption so that audiences can love him without feeling bad that they're endorsing a fascist. Because everything in the novels is focused on this world, which only Rowling can show us parts of. She can control what we see and how we feel about it. She can make things important or unimportant. And none of it clashes with our own knowledge of the world because we're not in our world. We're in the world of Harry Potter, which is her world that she's designed. But after 4 books, she decides to take the focus of the story away from her world. Oh, there's still parts of her world that are shown, but you start having things like, oh, the Prime Minister of Britain is involved, and oh, now we're going to start bringing in actions happening overseas, and oh, we're going to start trying to bring in other parts of the world, and all of this clashes with the audience, because the audience knows the real world because they live in the real world, and if you're going to present the real world as not being the real world, you have to do work. And again, she's incurious, so she doesn't want to do the work or doesn't think that she needs to. And so this creates a bunch of disconnects between the readers and the author. I don't want to harp on this too much because it's honestly a really small part of the story, but the fact that she hasn't considered things like the wider world in which this story takes place in makes it an extreme problem when she wants to bring in things like, oh, there are French and German wizards and other wizarding schools, because this immediately raises questions. Questions like, are there magical traditions other than the ones that our main characters use? There must be, because in the 3rd book, it begins by Harry reading about Ron's trip to Egypt, and they talk about curses in the tombs, which makes you go, okay, so there's magic in Egypt, and they're cursed, so did the Egyptian wizards use the same magical abilities as our main characters? Because that feels weird, and the fact that it feels weird is a flaw, because that's the tip of the iceberg to the rest of this problem. I said before that the strong part of her world is the fact that everything basically works because the author says it does. At no point does she feel the need to ever explain things like, how does magic work? Because it just does. She doesn't need to do things like, oh, there's a mana system, or oh, if you do this, it causes this. You don't need any of that. She doesn't feel you need any of that, because in her world that she's created, wizards just do things, and as long as they have the things that they need, they can do it. And this works as long as you keep your story local. As long as you keep your story to Britain, or at the very least, establish rules for why they are the way that they are. So we know wizards in Britain use wands and wear robes, and they all say spells and things like that. We know this because we see the main character and all the other characters doing it. When they introduce other wizards who speak other languages in the 4th book, it creates friction, because now we're like, okay, in the 1st book, it's made really clear with, I think in the movie they harp on this a whole lot with the Wingardium Leviosa thing, about how pronunciation is key, and you need to pronounce it a certain way, and if you don't, it won't work. And it's sort of a, like, gag, I guess, because they're trying to show that Hermione is a know-it-all and doesn't have social skills. But this becomes a problem when you realize that, okay, so there's French and German wizards. French and German wizards obviously aren't going to speak English because natively they would speak French and German. So do they use the same spells? If so, why is pronunciation important? Because obviously words in English and words in German are not the same. They don't even work with the same, like, underlying grammatical rules. Now, part of this could be explained because, oh, the spells that they say are basically Latin. But again, Latin is a Romance language, German is a Germanic language. Those don't match. With French, maybe. But with German, it's not the same. I think there's an image out there, actually, where it tries to show, like, the, what is it, like the 7 regions of the world with magical schools or something, and, like, 3 billion people are allocated to, like, one school because all of China, India, Japan, and Korea are all in one school or something. Because, again, J.K. Rowling is entirely incurious, but it speaks to a larger flaw in the narrative, which is she has given no thought to the underlying dynamics of the world. So, it would be possible, for example, to say that, oh, all wizards use wands and spells and do magic like this because this is how magic works. And the way you would do this is by saying that, okay, there are regional variations. Maybe they use different ingredients in their wands. Maybe they have different pronunciations. But overall, it's the same. Like, that's how you would do that. But that doesn't seem to be what she wants, because she's, again, incurious, and so she never fleshes it out. So it feels weird when they're bringing up things like Egypt. And I'm going to keep harping on that because ancient Egypt was 4,000 years ago, and it would be kind of weird if they were all using wands and speaking Latin, which hadn't been invented yet. I'm harping on this because it's a small point that spreads out across the entire narrative. It is the first point where problems start to arise, because at this point, you have to ask questions, and you don't want your audience asking questions. You don't want your audience questioning the underlying structure of your narrative universe. When the audience starts going, wait a second, how does that work? And you don't have an answer, it causes a disconnect. It takes them out of the story, and you don't want to do that. Again, for the first 4 books, she mostly keeps it under wraps because she's not really introducing lots of new concepts in terms of structure. She's mostly focusing on one boy and his lived experience, and we, as an audience, can live through him. Now, the end of the 4th book is, in my opinion, where all of the problems begin. And no, this is not a whole Cedric Diggory thing or whatever. It's not about that. It's about Voldemort and his role in the story and why he doesn't work and why his resurrection sort of dooms the story. As I said, Voldemort is basically the Grinch in the fact that everything bad can be associated with him. He probably kicks puppies. Like, that's the level of evil he is. The author wants him to be Wizard Hitler, but the problem is that he doesn't really work as an analogy towards that because of the nature of the universe she's built. However, without going into that, he works in the first book. He works because we only see him at the end. He is a mysterious figure who everyone talks about in hushed whispers. He is constantly talked up as this evil, malevolent thing. And that's good. And then when we finally are introduced to him, he's literally a parasite living on the back of somebody's head. And that works because in the end, he's vanquished, but he's not vanquished. His soul still exists. And so his essence, basically, is in this guy, and then when that guy crumbles away to dust, the soul is helpless. He is trapped in this hell of his own making, and he sort of exists as this ethereal force. Now, the way that they probably should have handled this is him being an ethereal force and either directly or indirectly causing things. So what I mean is, he, as a force, would be used by other people who want to use him to get their own things. essentially you have the big bad reduced to almost like a one ring type of thing. In fact, this is why this works in Lord of the Rings and doesn't work in Harry Potter, because in Lord of the Rings, Sauron never directly does anything. Like, he has done things, and everybody knows about him because everybody talks about how horrible he is, but his only real influence on the world as an entity is the ring. And the ring is so evil it corrupts everybody who holds it. This means that at no point in the story do the heroes ever have to fight Sauron himself, and so the author never is forced to humble this character. This guy can be the evilest thing in the universe, and he will remain so until the ring is thrown in the lava as a victory, but the victory comes without having to directly fight Sauron, because the fight against Sauron is the fight against the corruption of the ring. Make sense? Now, if you did that with Voldemort, where various evil wizards or people who wanted to gain his power or gain something from him were corrupted by his essence, you could do that. And that would mean that Voldemort himself would never actually have to fight our protagonist or ever directly enter the story as sort of a, like, actor on his own. Sauron, as I said, is not acting in the story. He is stuck as an eyeball in a tower or as the One Ring. All of the actions are done by other people. Because of this, he can be removed from the consequences of those actions, which is that they have to lose. Sauron loses, yes, but he still maintains his aura and his mystique because, again, they don't have to, like, sword fight him. If Aragorn, for example, had to sword fight, Sauron and beat him, you probably wouldn't be like, oh man, that dude was the evilest thing ever. You'd be like, why hasn't anybody else done that before? And Rowling, faced with this problem of, okay, I want this super evil villain, but I don't know what to really do with them in terms of the story, is sort of forced to bring him back as a direct actor, where he is acting opposite what is essentially a teenager. And that's weird, because, again, in the end, the embodiment of evil wizardry, the most powerful wizard that has ever lived, basically, is defeated by someone who can't legally drink or buy cigarettes in the United States. In essence, the problem is sort of the same problem that you see in a lot of, I want to say, low-budget fantasy stories, where a lot of stories have demons as the, like, big bad. Now, some stories are wise, and they realize that you don't want your protagonists to defeat the demon personally. You always need, like, something in between them that levels the playing field. Because if you're going to have, like, a cosmic entity as, your villain, you need to make it defeatable without making your protagonists into cosmic entities themselves. And so usually the way you do this is by making it so that they can't directly act, and so they have to act through someone else, or maybe they're possessing someone, or maybe, like, they have some handicap, is what I'm getting at. The problem with Voldemort is that because we've already seen how weak he is, and the author wants to write him getting stronger, he has to then start acting, and he has to notch up wins, because we, as the audience, are like, wait, isn't that the dude who was so weak that he had to, like, live as somebody else's, like, second face? Why are we taking this dude so seriously? Because, again, all of the evil stuff that got him his reputation happens off-screen and is talked about as, like, secondhand knowledge. Like, we know that he's done bad things, but we, as individuals, don't see that, because it's not part of the story. Like, yeah, Voldemort's out killing Harry's parents, but we didn't know Harry's parents. We didn't see their relationship develop. We didn't see, like, have 4 books to get used to them. We just know that they died because of this guy. This is where the story breaks into 2 separate stories that never fully reconcile. The author understands that her main character is 15 at this point, and so he's not even old enough to drive in the United States. Because Western fiction doesn't have the same cultural norms as, say, anime, it doesn't make any sense to have a kid who's 15 be your savior figure. In anime, you can get away with that because most anime is aimed at teenagers, and so the concept of a middle school student who is 15 saving the universe is a well-worn trope. But in Western fiction, that doesn't work, and the author recognizes this. But the author wants to have a showdown with her main villain, so she needs to build the main villain up, but she can only do that off screen. And so what happens is you have 2 stories going on. You have Harry, who is going through his school life, and you have Voldemort, who is ostensibly off camera doing lots of evil things and, I don't know, kicking puppies. However, and this is both to Rowling's credit and her detriment, she realizes that this is untenable. That it's impossible to build up hype and suspense about a guy who is doing lots of evil things off screen. And so she needs a way to build up their confrontation without it feeling like this is just a thing we are finally getting to. She wants their final confrontation to be climactic. She wants it to be important. And she doesn't want us to be like, get on with it already. And so here's the problem of having your rivalry be between a 15-year-old and an undead wizard. The 2 of them don't really have much in common or much to fight over. Like, yeah, he killed Harry's parents, but Harry was a baby. Yeah, he scarred him, and Harry destroyed Voldemort as he was when that happened. But beyond that, the 2 of them don't intersect in terms of, like, things that Harry does normally. Harry is at school learning things. Voldemort is out being a dictator to be. These 2 characters and their stories don't really have much in common. It's not like Voldemort is headmaster. You know what I mean? Harry has a bigger rivalry with most of the people he interacts with on a day-to-day basis because he interacts with them on a day-to-day basis. Again, Rowling grasps that this is a problem, and so her solution to it is to try to reach into her bag of tricks and attach as many story threads to both of them to pull them closer together. Imagine in your mind you have these 2 characters who are separated, and the fact that, again, he killed Harry's parents and stuff like that are individual bungee cords. Normally, the way you would do this is you would have their 2 stories sort of intersecting, and you would have them, like, directly doing things against one another constantly. But the author can't do that because Harry's still in school, and Voldemort is still out in the wilderness, basically. So, her solution is to take more bungee cords and try to strap them between the 2 of them. So she does things like, there are prophecies, and there's a whole, like, ministry of magical things that they want, and these things will help him or hurt him or whatever, and also he's split his soul into all these parts, and the parts that he's chosen are specifically tied to parts of the school, and, like, other things like that. It is extremely shoehorned in because the author needs to keep Harry at school for as long as possible in order to make, like, the story work. Because if he leaves too early, he's not going to have the knowledge he needs in order to defeat the big boss. But the big boss is outside of the school, and so she needs his things to all be, like, available for Harry to deal with. So, like, oh, he put his, like, a part of his soul in the cup, and he put another part of his soul in a book, and he put another part of his soul in, other things. And so, like, this also works as a way for the author to shoehorn in backstory from characters who are long dead. And the way you should look at this, the way you should think about this, is the author attaching the bungee cords. So every time she has to introduce something new, every time she has to, like, oh, there's a room full of these, like, prophecies, and the prophecies can only be said if they're broken, but we're never going to break any of them. And obviously we need them. Every time you need to introduce a new MacGuffin for a protagonist to go after, just imagine another bungee cord. And normally when you write a story, you shouldn't need too many of these. It should be enough that the characters naturally on their own progress towards each other. Again, let's go back to Lord of the Rings. Frodo and Sauron. Why are they having a confrontation? Because Sauron wants the One Ring so he can rule the world. Frodo wants to throw the One Ring into the volcano to stop him from ruling the world. These two goals intersect because the ring has to go to where Sauron is. Fundamentally speaking, in this story, if Voldemort just, I don't know, fucked off to South America, the story would just continue. Like, there would be no reason for Harry to go after him. There's nothing binding him to this conflict, because one thing that is never established is that Harry doesn't ever seem to feel, like, the need for vengeance. Like, he feels loneliness occasionally, but he doesn't remember his parents because he was a baby. He didn't really know them. Like, he's unhappy that he never got to be raised by them, but he doesn't feel like something was stolen from him, so he's not like a vengeful crusader type. And he doesn't really have, like, a passion for defeating evil on its own, even if he feels like injustice itself is something to stand against. So, remember when I said that in the beginning, in the first 4 books, Harry is kind of a blank slate in terms of, like, his characterization, and how the characterization of all the characters around him sort of supplement the fact that he is meant to be our blank slate character that the audience experiences the world through. This, when the story is about him experiencing the world and overcoming trials in that world, works. This stops working at book 5 because at book 5, Harry now needs a character. Because his character needs to fight Voldemort, and he doesn't have any reason to really do so beyond the fact that they are bound together. He himself does not feel like overwhelming passion to go and do things. In some ways, the reality of Harry being a blank slate character means that he either needs to not be in this story, which requires, like, an avenging crusader paladin type, or he needs to no longer be a blank slate character. And the author doesn't want that. The author doesn't want him to stop being the blank slate character, because that's what brought everybody into the story. She understands as a writer that the character being mostly a blank slate with no real, like, passionate stances on anything is what makes him so attractive to so many people. You can kind of compare this to, like, Bella Swan and Twilight or Katniss in the Hunger Games. These are characters who are mostly blank slates for the reason that the author wants the audience to put themselves in that position. So Harry, for the first 4 books, is mostly that blank slate because that's meant to be the audience stand-in. The audience is meant to go on this journey with the character. Book 5 suddenly needs this character to become a character that we are learning about. In other words, Harry Potter needs to go from blank slate audience stand-in to Geralt of Rivia. What I mean by that is these are fundamentally different stories, and they are fundamentally told in different ways. Harry Potter worked because, again, blank slate character. The story is not about him personally. It is not really about his choices. It's about his experiences in the world, and we get to see it through him. The Witcher series is about Geralt of Rivia, specifically his character. Geralt of Rivia is a person, and we are following his decisions, and we as an audience get to watch as he makes these decisions. The story cannot be told with any other character because Geralt of Rivia's story is about Geralt of Rivia himself. It is not so much about the world of The Witcher, although he goes out and does things in the world. It's about Geralt of Rivia's experiences in the world, which is different than Harry Potter's experiences exploring the world. I'm hoping I'm explaining this well, because these sound similar, and they are very similar, but they are fundamentally different in how the narrative is portrayed. I cycle back again to saying that the first 4 books and the last 3 are fundamentally different. And they are because suddenly our protagonist needs to go through what would have otherwise been 4 books of development in 3. And all of the development is counter to what came before. Now we need to develop the fact that this is a character who wants to fight Voldemort, that he is passionate about doing it, that he's not being forced into the role, but he is willingly taking it up because it's the right thing to do. We need to establish his morality, we need to establish his willingness to be a hero, we need to establish all of the things that should have been established 4 books ago in any other series. And here also is where we talk about the fact that the author suddenly finds herself unable to write a character who she herself understands. And I don't know how to say this any other way. The author doesn't know anything about teenage boys at all. And she's not curious enough to, learn how teenage boys think or how they act, which is why Harry's character suddenly feels weird and why the romances suddenly feel stilted, because teenage romance is not adult romance, and teenage puberty is a confusing, baffling time, and that doesn't work well when you want these characters to also save the world from, Magic Hitler. There's a reason why characters in, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe are children. Because when they're children, they're blank slates, but things don't really stick to them in the same way. They don't have the same problems, they don't have the same urges, they don't have the same, internal monologues that a teenager or an adult does. Growing up is a very hard thing to portray accurately, simply because every individual is changed by their own experiences, is the best way I can put this. The reality is that most people simply struggle to portray younger people because they themselves struggle to understand the world, which is natural at that age. I understand. I went back. I remember that time in my life. I remember what kind of person I was. And fundamentally, I was a completely different person from the person I am today. The person who I was at 15, almost 20 years ago now, is entirely different from the person who I am today, personality-wise included. And this is even harder when you talk about describing the experiences of somebody of the opposite sex. And so the things that Rowling starts to throw in, there's going to be a dance. Well, okay, you can do a dance plot, but the dance plot feels entirely out of place in this story that is also, about, genocide or possible genocide and Magic Hitler that is currently going on at the same time as this dance is meant to happen. Like, it feels entirely out of place, and it would even if the author knew how to write a teenage boy. Anyone can really write a child of any sex or gender. It really isn't hard, because before puberty, kids are basically all the same. In the sense of, like, they're blank slates being molded by the culture around them. If you took a bunch of children and separated them from the wider culture without any, like, pre-assumed gender norms to raise them, they would all probably turn out roughly the same. Because sex and gender are not innate concepts that imprint on us. There's no reason that women have to like Barbies and hair and men have to like G.I. Joes. That's not like an intrinsic concept to humanity. It just isn't. And so when Harry's a child, he can be a blank slate. That's perfectly fine. But when Harry's 15, 16, 17, when he's going through maturity, when he's going through, like, experiences that are fundamental, it would be as weird as if a guy tried to write, like, a teenage girl's teenage experiences. It would be weird, and you would notice that there would be things that didn't fit. Now, some of you are probably very smart, and you've probably already picked up on what I'm about to say, which is that if Rowling was competent at this, you could tie in the story of Harry becoming an adult with the story of a boy becoming a man, and you could make his ultimate proof of adulthood him coming into his own and defeating Voldemort. And you'd be right. That would be a good story. In fact, that would be the traditional way to write this story, of you have a character who begins the story as a child, and then as he becomes a man, he then triumphs over his greatest enemy. But that, again, contrasts with the fact that she chose to write Harry as an audience insert blank slate character. Because again, in order to write that story, you would need to do what every other hero's journey story does, which is you would need the tragedy of his life to occur when he's old enough to feel and experience loss. You would need him to become a character who is struggling with things like losing his parents. You would need things like him knowing who Voldemort is and swearing revenge against him, or something to that effect. You would need a reason that he needs to step up and do this thing. One of the more interesting things about Harry Potter, I think, is the way in which the author goes out of her way to avoid the traditional call to action plot. Now, normally when you write a story, there's a call to action moment. And this moment usually involves the death of somebody close to the main character. In this story, that call to action moment roughly happens, I think, in book 6, which is the Half-Blood Prince. It happens when Snape kills Dumbledore, which, again, is basically the closest thing that Harry has to a beloved figure in his life at that point. Like, the mentor figure dies. Like, that's a very traditional call to action moment. But the problem is Voldemort doesn't do that. Snape does it. And that doesn't, like, work. It doesn't work because your call to action moment is happening A, 6 books in, and B, is, like, so removed from everything else that it doesn't leave enough time for Harry's character to mature. You usually don't have your call to action moment right before the climax of your entire story, because that's really strange. The purpose of the call to action in a story is to get the characters moving, to move them towards something. It puts them on the first step of their hero's journey so that things can happen. Now, the author, I think, wanted Harry's parents being killed as the call to action. But the problem is Harry was a baby, doesn't really remember it, and so it can't really be a call to action. Now imagine if, for example, when he's 10, His parents are killed by Voldemort. He remembers it. He hates it. He's filled with all of these feelings about the fact that his parents were killed in front of him. And then he's, worst, moved from a family that he was happy in to the Dursleys. And he's now living this awful life. Imagine that. Imagine if, that was your setup. If you have a character who is 10 years old and he's just lost his parents to a murderer, and he's been moved to a family he doesn't like, and then at 11 years old, after a year of experiencing this awfulness, he's given a way out. And at first, he thinks, he's found his ticket to happiness, or perhaps he's found his ticket to getting revenge, because he's like, I want to go after Voldemort. And then he finds out, oh wait, the guy who killed my parents was a horrific guy. He's the boogeyman. Everybody's terrified of this guy. And so he learns how terrible and how scary this guy is. He, as a child, has to deal with all of these feelings of being an outcast and trying to struggle with the fact that magic is both an opportunity and amazing, but it's also the thing that killed his parents. And then at the end of book 1, you have him come face to face with the dead spirit of the guy he's been imagining himself fighting. And he sees this pathetic creature, attempting to cling on to life. And so you have this thing where they see each other, and he wants to hate Voldemort, but he can't, because he just sees this pathetic thing, and he's like, you're not even worth hating. And so you think, okay, so that's your story. But then you have 6 more books, and what you can do over those 6 books is focus on your character maturing over those 6 books. So you have Harry for the next 3 books basically dealing with day-to-day life. He thinks Voldemort's gone, but he isn't. And then he comes back in book 4, and that's when you begin the next stage of the hero's journey, where he realizes that I now really do hate you, and that's where you have that's where you should be having Voldemort kill Dumbledore in book 4. Because what should happen at that point is Harry thought he wants revenge, and then he doesn't want revenge, and then he's sort of at peace with his life. He's found a new life. Everything seems good, and then suddenly the stakes are raised. The guy who he thought was gone is not gone, and the second call to action happens because the mentor figure is killed. And then you have 3 books to deal with him, both A, going through puberty, and B, building up to their confrontation. J.K. Rowling can't do that because of the way that she paced the books, the way that she structured the narrative. And you'll notice that I'm not mentioning characters like Sirius Black, because Sirius Black kind of works as the mentor figure, but the way that he dies is in such a way that doesn't act as a call to action. You could do a thing where Sirius Black, my only family, is killed, but in order for it to be a call to action, he would need to be killed by Voldemort himself to give Harry a reason to fight him. And then you would also have a reason like, oh, when we're fighting, I could, kill you. I could destroy you. I could be just like you, but I am choosing not to be like you. Again, this is basic storytelling. This is the most basic story structure known to man. This is a story arc which has been done to death. And again, there's a reason for that, because it works. J.K. Rowling chose to structure her story either through incompetence or because she felt it was better. I don't know which. But whatever the reason is, she chose to structure her story this way, and it doesn't work. When I talked about Lore Olympus, I talked about structure in the form of, when do you put the time skip? And in Harry Potter, time skips happen at the end of every year, which is fine. But it almost does the same thing, where it puts something that is meant to be at the end or the middle of your story, and it puts it at the point where you need right before the climax. In this case, it puts the call to action moment right before the climax. and it doesn't work because Harry then has to go through like 3 books worth of character development to become a character and bring him to the moment where he is the person who needs to be the person to fight Voldemort. That's not good. I should also note that all of the books get longer as they go on, to the point where I think the last book is as big as the first 2 combined. I don't know about that, and there's a reason for that. Okay, the scope is out of control, and she can't like juggle this many balls all at once, but she also is trying to shove a whole lot of development all at once. She is trying so hard to like rapidly force the story to the point where it can conclude. I want to point out here, though, that this is not a problem that is unknown to authors. Lots of authors have this problem. In fact, many writers have this problem. Many writers, simply put, don't know how to end their story. Many writers get overwhelmed by the amount of characters and the amount of plot lines so they insert into their story, because a thing that seems cool at the time can often spiral into something which becomes a major headache later. Lore Olympus had this problem, as I mentioned before, but lots of other stories go through this. Comics all have this problem. Major famous stories like Berserk have this problem of the author just loses track of what he's interested in writing. Where is the plot going? Where is the story going? Normally, the way you solve this is you get an editor, or you find somebody who can like look at your draft and go, no, we need to fix it. The problem is J.K. Rowling is a victim of her own success in this regard. That's the only conclusion I can draw based on her actions years later when she was dealing with the Fantastic Beasts series. For those unaware, J.K. Rowling wanted direct control in those movies. She wants to act as the controlling figure in who is cast, how is the script written, whether or not certain plot points are emphasized or de-emphasized. That sort of control is relatively normal for an author, as I said, because the author is the only window for the audience. But what that tells me is, if she's that focused on controlling all of these things, what this tells me is she's probably not the type who is willing to have an editor hack their story to pieces. Furthermore, again, as I said at the very beginning, her stories were revolutionary in terms of the industry. They made a lot of money. They were a cultural phenomenon. Okay? They were a genuine cultural phenomenon that came out of nowhere. And so I have a feeling that the people who were like overlooking her books and saying things like, oh, that's really long, or oh, that's really meandering, probably didn't feel the need to make those objections too strongly, because she's a golden goose, and every time she produces a book, you make millions and millions of dollars. So why should you step in and stop her from, sabotaging her own work through what is normally considered artist incompetence? Although it's not really that. It's more like the story just gets out of hand. I've talked about this with One Piece many times, where the author just sort of went off on his own and just ignored the rest of the story, and he could keep doing that because his story continues to make money. And so the more money you make, the more success that you have, the fewer people are going to tell you no, because they're going to assume you know what you're doing. This happens to everyone who's successful, I think. Over time, the amount of people who are going to tell you no decreases. So I think the perfect example of this is someone like Christopher Nolan, where Christopher Nolan, in a very short time period, produced some of the best movies, I think, in the last 20 years. He produces movies like Inception and The Dark Knight, and everyone's like, this is amazing. And then 10 years go by, and he's producing Tenet, one of the worst movies ever, and it shows off all of his bad tendencies. Because what happens is that all of the people who are around him, who told him no, you need to pull this in, you need to decrease this, etc., all disappeared. all those people are feeling unneeded, or the people who would hire them and empower them think they're unneeded because this is somebody who's made all this money. This happens all the time in all kinds of industries. I think the best example of this comes from the end of the new Hollywood era of films. So there was, I forget the guy's name, but he made The Deer Hunter and he won Oscars. And because he won all these awards, the guys at United Artists were like, okay, you can do whatever you want. Have an infinite budget, basically. And what he produced next was a movie called Heaven's Gate, a movie that was so over budget, it single-handedly destroyed the entire new Hollywood era of Hollywood. It made it so that directors no longer had the same power that they used to because you couldn't trust directors not to bankrupt the studio. It's also the reason why you see things like no animals were harmed in the making of this production, because he insisted on doing things like making everything real. And so, there were a lot of horses in that movie who were dealing with getting shot by cannonballs, and so they all got PTSD, and it was really horrible. But that's what I mean. When you let creators who are successful do whatever they want, the result is usually not good. It's usually disastrous. And that's what I think happened with Harry Potter. I think the first 4 books were her decision to do this thing, and she realized at book 5 that she only had 2 more books after that point with which to create the endgame which she wrote in book 1. And so now you need to do catch up. So she needs to entirely retool her story in order to get things back on track. But the problem is that there's so much in those books that she needs to accomplish. There's so much she wants to do. She wants to tell a coming-of-age story. She wants to tell a revenge story. She wants to tell a story about loss. She wants to tell a traditional story where the hero's journey occurs. She wants to tell a story about a teenage boy dealing with his first rejection. She wants to tell all of these stories about authority that doesn't listen to the people who know things. She wants to tell stories about like charismatic villains. She wants to tell corruption stories. She wants to tell so many stories in these 3 books that there's no focus. It is all over the place, and that's why they get so bloated, because she's playing catch up and she's unfocused, and it's a mess. I know people who really love the last 3 books. In my opinion, they're the weaker ones of the story because, and say it with me now, simplicity is king. Okay? Simplicity is everything in storytelling. There's a reason why simple stories get told and retold over and over again. It's because they work. That doesn't mean you have to tell them verbatim, but it does mean that, again, the bigger your scope, the bigger your problems are going to be. So again, Harry Potter worked, in my opinion, when it was about an audience insert character dealing with problems and experiencing a world with the audience. It fails when she suddenly has to retool her entire story. The story works when she doesn't need to do things like world building, because she's fundamentally uninterested in the rest of the world. In some ways, I wonder if it could have been saved. My hypothesis on this is that it couldn't. So, I know that some people would probably argue that they, or some better writer or whoever, could have saved this story, that they could have taken over the reins at book 4 and, without retooling the story too much, gotten to where the ending was supposed to be by book 7. I don't think that's possible. I don't think with the characters as they end book 4 as can be retooled into characters that will work for the story she's trying to tell in book 7. Because I think that the story in book 1 through 4 is fundamentally structurally different than the stories in books 5 through 7. I think that when she changes the scope of the story from being a story about somebody exploring the world to a story about somebody needing to rise to an occasion, the entire thing falls apart. As I said before, if Harry was a different character in the first 4 books, you could do that, but it would require retooling certain narrative, like plot points, in order to make it work. If he's a different character, or in some ways remained the same character that he was in book 4 and book 7, it really wouldn't work. In fact, it would work even less, because you can't do that story that's being told in books 5 through 7 with an audience insert character. In some ways, this is the problem that things like Twilight struggled with, where Bella Swan begins as an audience insert, and it kind of works, but it fails when the character needs to become an actual character that is more than an audience insert. When your audience insert character has to become a character, they become, in some ways, an actor in the story. What I mean by that is that their actions have consequences that are lasting and can't be undone. In the earlier books of Harry Potter, for example, there isn't a whole lot that he chooses to do that can't be undone that's bad. This is why at the end of those books, at least the first 3, it's a triumphant moment. And then he can start the new year basically with a clean slate. And so every year, like, things happen and they build up, and then at the end of the year, everything is wiped clean and you can start fresh. Yeah, you're still using the same characters, but there aren't really lasting consequences to the actions. The fact that, Professor Quirrell turned to ash is not really like a problem in book 2. The fact that they conquered, the various traps that got to, the Sorcerer's Stone really doesn't have anything like any impact on book 2. The fact that they find the Chamber of Secrets in book 2 has basically no impact on book 3. And that's perfectly fine. You can keep doing that. You could make a 40-book series out of that. Some people do. But you can't do that with 7. Like, you can't do that if you want, like, an ending. You can't do that. At some point, your characters are going to need to make choices that they can't come back from. You're gonna have to, like, make decisions. And I have evidence to prove that Rowling doesn't like this. Okay? And the best example of this is Draco Malfoy. The best example of a character where the author wants to have it both ways. She wants him to be the antagonist, but she also wants his redemption arc. And so, like, she wants this character to be, like, Harry's, like, ultimate rival, and he's mostly, like, the antagonist through most of the books. And then, like, at the end, it's, no, he's chosen to be different from his father. And it's like, you can't do both. Like, at some point, you need to make choices have consequences, or nothing matters. And so, like, having, like, all of these serious choices have consequences that the author clearly doesn't want to have lasting impacts, like, doesn't sit well with her style of writing. At least not with the first 4 books. And so, like, as I said, these are 2 different kinds of stories. Like, Harry exists in the first 4 books, but after that point, like, he starts having a character. And that's where all the problems start, because the author clearly didn't plan to have, like, all of this happen all at once. I guess in some ways, this is going on way too long for me just to say, hey, the pacing sucks, and the author changed her mind about how she wanted her story to go halfway through, and at that point, nobody was around to tell her no, and she's terrible at world building because she's an incurious person. I have just summed up, like, an hour and a half in, like, 2 sentences. And that's kind of my evaluation of Harry Potter. Like, it's okay. I think it's really good in the beginning, and I think it's not so good at the end. I think Harry Potter is a series that shows all of J.K. Rowling's talents and bad habits as a writer. I don't think J.K. Rowling is the worst writer ever. I don't think she lacks talent. I think J.K. Rowling is somebody who fell into the same pit that lots of other writers do, where she begins by emphasizing all of her strengths, and by the end, all she's doing is emphasizing her weaknesses, either because she doesn't realize they're weaknesses, or because she's trying to dig herself out of a hole and instead just keeps digging it deeper. I don't know which. I would say she probably digs it deeper given what she did later with like Fantastic Beasts, but I don't know. It's one of those two. Anyway, that's way too long to be talking about Harry Potter. So that's my formulation about all of the problems with Harry Potter. Hopefully you found this interesting. This has been Your Story Stinks. I don't know what I'm going to do next. See y'all later.